The phrase living legend gets thrown around quite liberally these days, usually by lazy journalists and Kanye West. Those are the two. But the person who is going to be occupying this seat momentarily certainly qualifies. Over the last 50 years, every major story from Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, JFK's assassination, Watergate, all the way up through 9/11, he's been front and center in telling us these stories. And the amazing thing is he's 82, soon to be 83, and is not slowing down at all. He has 2 shows currently regularly on Access TV. And when I say that he's doing these, he's not anchoring them, he's going around and reporting them, traveling around the world. Rather amazing. So I can't wait to talk to him about his remarkable career, and also talk about the state of news media, which, as we know, is shifting seismically almost on an hourly basis. So, without further ado, let me introduce to you a living legend, Dan Rather. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, paradoxically, why don't we start by talking about endings, or at least third acts. As I was saying, you are remarkable. You're 82. You're going to be 83 on Halloween, correct? And you have these 2 shows, and as I said, you're not sitting behind an anchor desk. You're traveling around the world. You're doing actual deep dive investigative reporting. My question to you is, you seem like you are a man who still wants to prove something. What drives you like this these days?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that overly generous introduction. I hope everyone realizes what Abe Lincoln once said about such introductions. Never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves, and so it will be with you. But in answer to your question, I don't think I have anything to prove anymore. There certainly was a time in my life, a long time in my life, from maybe adolescence through 55 or 60, somewhere in there, when I felt I had things to prove. Can I cut it with the best reporters in the world? Others will have to judge whether I did or not, but I was driven by that. But now, I have a passion for news. I don't know why that is. I've always had it for as long as I can remember. I have a passion for covering news. I love covering news. And that's what keeps me at it, because I love it. I can't wait to get to a story. The travel is nothing to me, because it's my transport to the story. I have a passion for doing it as the best I can come up with.
Now, he's written 3 memoirs. The last one is called Rather Unspoken. It's actually an understatement when you read it. And one of the things that you talk about, Cassandra-like, you are warning us that there is an unholy trinity at play in the news world. The politicization, the corporatization, and the trivialization of the news. Can you expand on that a little bit? What you see as this looming danger for our society?
Well, I do think it's a real and present danger. Let me say that I am an optimist by experience and by nature. But I am concerned about what's happened to news, particularly in this country. And I have categorized it, the problems of politicalization, corporatization, and the trivialization. The first 2 have led in no small way to the latter, to the trivialization. And it is, and let's speak frankly here, I won't try to dress it up. Very big government, whether that government at any particular time in Washington is directed by Republicans or Democrats, very big government is in bed with big corporate media for their mutual benefit, not for the benefit of the public, not in the public interest. And that's a change. It hasn't been that long ago when electronic journalism, radio and television journalism, to say nothing of print, was seen as a public trust. And those who held the public trust were emotionally involved in the responsibilities of that trust, the trust to do public service. Completely gone now, as we've had larger and larger entities take control of more and more of news distribution, to the point now where by some people's count, no more than 6, my count is 4, very large corporate entities control more than 80% of the true national distribution of news. Now stop, exclamation point. it hasn't been that long ago when that figure was 55, 57. So as a result of this, with the public service element going completely out of coverage, nobody who's a CEO of one of these large media companies wants to talk about public service. He wants to talk about demographics, wants to talk about ratings, because that's where the money is. So the large corporations, they have needs in Washington. They need legislation passed. They need regulations stopped or started. They have all kinds of instruments. And for the Washington power structure, again, whether it be Democratic or Republican, they want what is basically sweetheart coverage. And increasingly, each of these two entities, corporations and the political powers, help each other, but that's not to the benefit of the news consumer, if you will. And one of the ways to do it is that it's much easier to get 5 people in a room shouting at one another their opinions about what we should do in, say, Afghanistan than it is to staff a full bureau in Afghanistan. And increasingly, that's what I mean. Also, you can get in trouble by exposing the truth behind some power, be it a president, a congressman, or whatever. You don't get any trouble by talking about the Kardashians or Madonna. So increasingly, the trivialization, one, is cheaper to do trivial news coverage. 2, there's no risk. It's a no-risk job.
So basically, let me ask you a question, frankly. In this atmosphere today, does CBS's history-making, history-altering report on Watergate, for instance, where you brought together all the reporting that had been done both by the Post and the New York Times, and it really changed the course of history of our country. Does that get done today?
I doubt it. I doubt it. In a way, it's a hypothetical question. We don't know until it's put to the test. But the insidious thing is you may not know. But I doubt it very seriously. And the reason is mentioned, that the head of the corporate superstructure, I think these are all very good people. I wish I could get in a room with them. I'm probably not the guy. But I wish you could get in the room and say to them, listen, you're making money hand over fist. What about your legacy to the country? Why not have the kind of legacy that, say, William S. Paley had at CBS News? By building a news operation that's built on the premise, we're here to do a public service. But because that is not the case, then I have my doubts whether a corruption in the very highest places of government would be exposed as it was before. Now, on the other side of that is we're now in the internet age. Watergate happened during the television age. Yeah. I'm old enough to have grown up in the print age, which gave way to radio, the age of radio, which gave way to television, and now in the internet age. The saving grace of what I've just said, I wouldn't expect one of the very large corporate news reporting entities to do that story, but they might be forced to by somebody who gets on the internet. It might be in a not very well watched section of the internet, but call attention to the story, and as the public got interested, one of the big entities might have to take it on.
Well, like you, I am an optimist. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And, although in some ways these are the worst of times, I think they're also perhaps, hopefully, the best of times. Right. And I think you touched on it partly with the internet. This is the moment we live in. A heretofore random Syrian broke the story of the U.S. bombing targeting ISIS 30 minutes before the Pentagon announced it.
Right.
Phenomenal, right? This fact that he then became a leading edge of journalism and then live blogged much of the bombing. So in that way, is the internet the saving grace, along with the fact that everybody has in their pocket, which I seem to have put somewhere else, a fantastic camera, and that we can live stream, things like Occupy Wall Street or what's happening in Hong Kong?
I think it has the potential to be, but here's the way I see it, rightly or wrongly. We're still, as great as the internet is, and by the way, we are definitely in the age of the internet. And I would argue that the current war, as President Obama has called it, against ISIS, is the first social media war. Vietnam was the first television war. World War II was the first radio war. This is the first social media war turned in. Now, what has happened with journalism is that the old order is dead. Some of it's still operating. And we are journalistically in what the Catholic Church calls, I'm not a Catholic. They have a very interesting word, an interim. We're in the interim. The old order is gone. The new order is not yet in place. We haven't figured out a way what the new order is going to be. Whatever it is, it would be part of the internet. Now, what you described with someone in Syria can become the leading edge, that's true. However, we have to weigh against that the potential for manipulation of news. The internet is the greatest opportunity for manipulation of news and outright propaganda that has yet existed. Greater than television, greater than radio, greater than film. Partly because, and I'm not fond of quoting Adolf Hitler, but Hitler said, those who control the images control the race. And so it is. And the internet's ability, what it puts on, and can it be verified?
Right.
This was verified. His report,
Yes.
the series report. But they have to be professional journalists somewhere
Yes.
to verify coming down the pike. You wouldn't, you know, if your gut pains you for 3 days, you don't want your neighbor prescribing what you should take. You want a doctor.
Yeah.
If you want the muffler changed on your automobile, you want a professional mechanic. You don't want to go down the street doing. And if you want news, the kind of quality news of integrity, which you and I are talking about, then you want professionals to do it.
What we've always tried to do at HuffPost is combine the best of the old and the best of the new. Yes, of course,
Right.
fact checking is vital. You know, getting it right is
Well,
endlessly
and that's the
important.
future. When I say we're in the interregnum, moving toward
Yeah.
the future, that is the future. We have to combine the old, the best of the old, the
Yeah.
tradition of the old, of is it accurate, is it fair,
Yeah.
in addition to is it interesting. You have to combine that with the new world, and you have to find a way to finance it, which we haven't talked about, which is the biggest single problem with the kind of quality news that we'd like to have, is who's going to pay for it.
I want to get to that in a second, because it is very interesting. It's the thing that we wake up every day, and I look at some AOLers out here, and you know we talk about a lot is how we're going to pay for it. But I want to stay on this idea of video for a minute. We've had all these very high-profile stories recently. The Ray Rice, obviously, elevator video, the Donald Sterling, horrible racist rant, but also you know some of these police shootings. Where they claim something and then we see the video and, well, they actually did not give them fair warning before they opened fire, or the guy in California pummeling the woman on the side. What do you have we gotten to the point now where even Dan Rather telling me something isn't enough? You know, are we so we've all become Missouri, we're the show me state, right? I have to see it to believe it.
I think we've moved pretty far in that direction. And therefore, I think it's very important for us as a society, as a people, if you will, as consumers of news, to pause and say, skepticism is absolutely essential, not cynicism. There's a difference between cynicism and skepticism. As a working journalist, I've spent my lifetime trying not to become cynical. There's a stereotype of reporters, as you know, being cynical because we see the underside, the Dickensian side of life. But it's very important for news consumers, and I think to be trained at a very early age. I'm in favor of teaching news consumption no later than about the 7th grade. To be skeptical of what you see, not cynical about it, but skeptical and ask questions. Is this real? Because, again, we get back to the ability to manipulate the images, that you can move public opinion pretty quickly with a false or doctored piece of video.
You know, the interesting thing is, I agree with you completely. Obviously, we've seen that. But I think we also see, to use an overused phrase, the wisdom of the crowd sometimes is that it comes out rather quickly. Wait a minute, that's not the case. I
agree.
You know, we had this woman, for instance, this is much smaller, it's not changing the world, but, you know, who claimed that she was being arrested unfairly, the actress in Los Angeles.
Right.
And then other people quickly weighed in, well, that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
And we have the tape of her talking to the policeman. And here's photos of her with her, you know, boyfriend. And so I think there is some sort of a countermeasure.
Oh, there definitely is. And by the way, most of us, and I include myself in this criticism, most of those of us in journalism have not used this as an investigative tool. For example, if we're working on an investigative story, we've been trying to experiment with this some on the program I do for Access TV, saying, put it on the internet. We're working on an investigative story of, I don't know, the abuse of clergymen, of youngsters. We're working on this story. We have a lot of material, but if anybody has information, and people can send it in. Now, you then have to sort it out and verify it, but you can have literally millions of extra reporters helping you if you can get the word out.
This may be inside baseball, but allow me one question. I don't get to sit next to Dan Rather that often. So on something like the Ray Rice video, we know that TMZ paid for that, right? And they paid for the Sterling thing. And of course I understand why you wouldn't want to pay a source, because then they'd be willing to change what they say to get money. But a tape is a tape is a tape.
Right.
Should we pay for that?
I'm old school. I don't believe in paying for news, but I fear that I'm behind the curve on this, and you make an important difference. Paying a source is off the boards, definitely. Paying for a videotape, which is material, and something as potent and as, if you will, story-changing as that, TMZ. I have to take deep breath and say, if it were put to me, would I have bought the tape? Yes.
That was the argument I was making in a meeting 2 days ago. I will now say Dan Rather agreed with me, which is, that feels good. So reading your book and hearing what you say about the corporatization, it put into mind, have you guys watched Network recently? The movie Network? If you haven't, I commend it to you heartily. It was made in 1976, and I now think it maybe is the most prescient movie ever made, right? At the moment it was released, it seemed like broad satire. Now it plays like a documentary. To the point, Ned Beatty has that great speech where there's no America, there's no democracy, there's just AT&T, there's just IBM. Do you ever feel like I've now walked into some form of, Paddy Chayefsky universe? That's the real world that we're living in now?
I would say beginning sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s, I had that thought. I'd like to tell you I had that thought when Network first came out. I didn't. I thought it was a little bit overdone. Now, in retrospect, if anything, it was underdone. The genius of it, and I do agree with you, it's one of the most prescient movies of our time, is he realized with the consolidation of AT&T and other big corporations, that sooner or later it would come to media. It wasn't there yet, but it would come. That when the Bill Paleys and Leonard Goldenstons of the network world died off and their sense of public news as public service, then it would be inevitable this would develop. But no question, as we got deeper into the 1990s and entered the 21st century, you can see how prescient the movie was.
Yes, you have meddled with the forces of nature, Mr. Beale. Speaking of prescience, I've been reading a lot about Dan's life and his opinions, and the more I read in preparation for this, the more I was struck by how prescient you were and how on the cutting edge you were on a lot of things that now are very applicable to the moment that we find ourselves in. For instance, in 1980, you were on the front lines in Afghanistan, and you wore the garb of the Mujahideen, and you got a lot of flack for that. They dubbed you Gunga Dan, among other things, right? And Doonesbury made fun of you. Now, that kind of immersive reporting would brand you as an ultra hipster and get you a job at Vice.
Yes, that's true, and probably at 4 times the salary I was making at that time, too. No, but it is true that for better or for worse, and I understand there are people who want to argue either way, that I've always believed in driving to the heart of the story. Another way to put it, you have to walk the ground. And with that story, when we walked into and out of Afghanistan just after the Soviets had invaded at the end of 1979, that you call it news instinct if you want, that I did say to myself, this looks to me like it might be the story of this decade and one of the most important stories of the latter third of the 21st century. And it turned out to be that. I could give you a long list, I won't, but I can give you a long list of times when my instinct turned out not to pan out that well. But it is true that when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it was our sense, the reason we went was the sense is, if this succeeds, the Soviet Union may wind up winning the Cold War. They get a warm water port and a lot of other things. And if it doesn't succeed, it could be the end of communism in Russia as we've known it.
Now, mentioning Vice, we are seeing, obviously, it's not new, but we've seen this massive seismic shift in the way people consume news.
Right.
Places like Vice, I like to think, like HuffPost, HuffPost Live.
I agree.
And we also see, I think it's something like 6% of people 18 to 38 watch the network news.
Right.
They now get their news, well, we hear they get it from Jon Stewart, or they get it now from John Oliver,
Right.
or places like HuffPost Live or Vice. What do you think about this? Is this good, is this bad, or is this just the way it is?
Well, I think you can argue it's good, it's bad, but that argument doesn't matter. It's what is, it's what's coming. The trend line is very clear, and we have to adjust to it. What I'm hopeful we'll get out of it is a new tradition of journalism, wedded to the old tradition of, again, is it accurate, is it fair, is it important, does it matter? You know, most people who get into journalism, not just in my generation, but before my generation and since, I work with a lot of young journalists. Most journalists get into journalism because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They want to do work that matters. They want to do work that's important. And journalism at its best, quality journalism, independent, truly independent journalism, fiercely independent, fighting journalism when necessary, gives you that sense. Now, in the internet age, I think this can be a whole new tradition built around the kind of coverage you have on the internet. And with that ethos is possible. Do we have it now? No. Are we going to have it? I think we will.
Optimists again. So let's get back to the question you raised about funding, because it is the vital question.
Yeah.
You know, how do we pay for this? How do we pay for great reporting? At the moment, it seems like we may be heading to a new era of the media baron, right? I mean, you work under the auspices of Mark Cuban.
Right.
We have Pierre Almodovar, investing $250 million in
Right.
First Look Media. Jeff
Right.
Bezos is buying the Washington Post. We'll see what becomes
Right.
of that. Is that what we have? ProPublica, which of course is a nonprofit. Is this the way that we are going to? Is it the new era of the Hearsts and the Pulitzers and the Chandlers?
I think it could be, but I don't think that's the, if you will, the final answer. It's part of this interregnum I mentioned before. As a stopgap and as an addition, fine. But in the end, I think we have to find a model. We don't have it now that will make a profit. I think medium and long pull, short range, this works. Medium and long pull, in the end, you have to figure a way to make a profit. I wish I had the model for making a profit from deep digging investigative reporting and on the ground intensive international news, to name two. I don't have it. Until we can get that, I don't think there are enough people prepared to do what Mark Cuban has done with Access TV and some of the other examples. I just don't think there are enough to sustain it over time.
Another thing that jumped out at me when I was reading about you was, at your last broadcast, I believe it was in 2005,
Right.
you saluted a lot of people, and among the people that you called out were journalists who, as you said, are risking it all to tell the stories of our time. And you said a word that you had coined and brought back, and you said, you wish them courage.
Yeah.
Well, we live in a time now, this is probably the most dangerous era in the history of media for journalists. Since 2000, over 700 have been killed doing their job. Over 2,000 have been imprisoned for doing their job. You have put yourself in very dangerous situations, whether it was a gun to your head during the civil rights era, Vietnam, with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Is this just part of the job, or is there something we can do to protect the people telling us these vital stories?
Well, both cases that I'm fond of saying because it's true. Not every day, but if you seek to be a journalist of world class, then on some days, in some ways, danger is my business. And it has to be your business if that's what you aspire to be. And it's very hard for people on the outside to understand what drives journalists to go to a place like Syria today, which is the single most dangerous place in the world for a journalist, and I would argue the most dangerous there has ever been for a journalist. It is much more dangerous to be a foreign correspondent today and to go to these hellholes than it's ever been. Was it dangerous to walk in and out of Afghanistan? You bet. Was the Vietnam War dangerous? You bet. But nothing to compare. Well, I wouldn't say nothing to compare, but it doesn't bear comparison very much with what's the reality today in Syria, some parts of Iraq, Somalia. This is not an all-inclusive list. But there will be journalists who will go, and God bless them, and we should bless them, because this drive to say, you can't report in depth and with perspective unless you walk the ground. And you can't say, well, Syria's off limits because kidnappings run amok, murders, beheadings, what have you. You've quoted the figures. It's the most dangerous time ever to be a journalist. But there will always be those journalists who say, danger's my business some of the time, and who will go.
Let me ask you a provocative question, since it's what we do. Does this, I don't want to make the leap to the danger part of it, but we also seem to be living in an era where journalists are not as respected or are not accorded maybe the same respect, particularly from the government. We see a very antagonistic relationship. Eric Holder is now stepping down, but one of, maybe one of the signatures of his time as Attorney General was going after journalists. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well,
do you think there's a connection?
I'll talk about it. It's not happily so, because I want to make it clear that in the criticism that I'm going to level in my answer, I include myself in that criticism. That we don't have the respect we once had because we don't deserve it. We haven't earned it. Respect is earned, one story at a time, one great story at a time. And respect is built on authenticity, being who you say you are. Now, having said that, it's very difficult for individual journalists to have respect these days, because if you're going to get respect, you need to work someplace where your work is seen, and as outlined earlier, it's very difficult if the ethos of the organization is, we want to be careful. We want to be careful, especially with powerful. And the more powerful an entity or person is, the more careful we're going to be with them. If you're operating in that ethos, you aren't going to have the kind of respect you would have that we had, for example, at CBS News. And don't misunderstand me, there were other good organizations. But at CBS News, when I started in the 1960s, and I would say through the 1970s, those of us who worked there believed that it was a kind of magical, mystical kingdom in which every correspondent was expected to be a knight, expected to be courageous, expected to be smart, expected to be fair, and that everybody bought into it. And the idea that a CBS News correspondent, this knight, if you will, of our own imagination, could not be corrupted. He didn't buy and he couldn't be bought. Now, it may not have been true, but the fact that we believed it was true made it something real, and it asked something of you. Now, that climate had been created over a 20 or 30-year period before I got to CBS News, but that was the reality. This has disappeared from American journalism by and large. And as it disappeared, we lost increasing hunks of respect from the audience, because the audience is smart. My experience with the audience in television for all these years is the audience is a hell of a lot smarter than almost anybody in the business side of it gives them credit for being. And the audience smells it. They instinctively know if you're authentic and your organization is authentic, they will grasp what the ethos of the organization is. And because the ethos in what I consider to be the most important ethos for journalism has disappeared, a lot of the respect has disappeared with it.
I'm going to put a button in what you said about authenticity and come back to that in a second, because I want to stay on this. You said that right along this line of deserving respect or not deserving respect, right, that for you the number one job of a journalist is speaking truth to power.
Right.
It seems today that for many in the media, the number one job is building their personal brand.
That's true.
And it has journalism now just become another path up Celebrity Mountain?
In some ways it has. And again, I don't want to accept myself from the criticism of this. In some important ways it have. I do want to point out that there are people and there are some entities, some journalistic enterprises that do not fit this mold. But your hypothesis, by and large, I fear is true. And money makes a difference. When you can build a brand that makes you a $10, $12 million a year person, that's a big incentive. I might know that better than some people. It's a very big incentive. But this is one of the things that those of us in the craft have to deal with. On the one hand, if you want to be respected, if you want to have influence, you need to build your brand. On the other hand, to build your brand, you need to know what you stand for, what you will do and what you won't do. And so often a mistake is made, and I sit here as one who's made the mistake, if you don't ask yourself those important questions. Say, I want the brand, I want a known brand, I want it known all over this and other universes, but I want the brand to stand for something. Now, we usually deal with just how do you expand the brand, not I want the brand to stand for something.
In retrospect, this is personal, but I'll ask you anyway, you seem like you live, breathe reporting.
I do.
That's your thing.
I do.
And yet you spent 24 years behind the anchor desk, not exclusively,
Yeah.
but which is largely a in England they call them presenters.
They do.
Right? Was that the right path for you, or were you drawn into, well, I have to do that because that's the next step? I mean, I've got to replace Cronkite because that's the next step.
Well, about that, I can say truthfully and candidly that what I sought to bring to the anchor chair when I came to it in 1981, let's pause and say, when someone says you're going to succeed Walter Cronkite, we all know what happens to people who succeed names like icons like a Cronkite. Usually the first person that takes the job gets his head blown off, which I was told metaphorically, professionally would happen to me. But anyway, I said to myself, listen, I can't be Walter Cronkite. I'm not Walter Cronkite. I have to be Dan Rather. That led to the question, well, what got me to this anchor chair? Rightly or wrongly, I believe what got me there was the strength of my reporting. Brand, if you will. Look, this guy he may or may not be a congenial uncle type. He may not be the ideal anchor person, but he's a reporter. So I sought to bring to the anchor chair, you mentioned you're just a presenter. I didn't want to be a presenter. I said, if I wind up being only a presenter, I failed. At least I failed myself. I don't give you a long answer, but it was. So we came up with the idea of being, it's an oxymoron in a way, the mobile anchor, which is to say, with the new technology, remember, satellite had been around for a while, but they were coming, you could afford to do the news, not just a piece of the news, you could afford to do the whole newscast from anywhere in the world. You could do it from a battle zone, you could do it from Moscow, you could do it anywhere in the world. So we developed this technique of the anchor moves. The anchor doesn't just stay in the studio. And we took the broadcast. It's now common practice to do, but as I say, we developed the technique. So I never felt to myself as a presenter. I never felt to myself frankly, as an indoor anchor. I said, I felt I was a reporter who'd been promoted into a dream job, go anywhere, anytime, with fantastic resources, and report on the ground.
So let's get back to authenticity. For me, that is the key thing that you have to have. We're here at Adweek. Whether you're a brand or whether you're a personality, that's the internet to me. Yeah. It has a bullshit detector that's very powerful. And that's something that you've always said about yourself, is that the one thing that you wanted to present, as you say, maybe you're not avuncular, but you're authentic. Can you talk a little bit about authenticity and how you can break through the clutter of a digital universe where there's so many voices and so many people to say, this is authentic?
Well, it begins with, perhaps one of the most quoted lines of Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. That you have to know about the internet, particularly about the internet. I would say the whole new digital world. That what you mentioned, the bullshit detector, the needle will kick against the post at any time the audience even begins to suspect you are not who you say you are. Now, if you say you're a reporter, then you damn well better be a reporter, because you're going to be exposed to something else. It may be something that's profitable, but you won't be believable with the audience. But part of this comes, when I came up in journalism, first of all, it was extremely hard to get a job. I know young journalists today say, God, it's very difficult. It was hell to catch a job. But to be accepted, you had to serve an apprenticeship. You had to work the police beat. You had to know what happened at the charity hospital after midnight on Saturday night. You had to know what happened in the worst neighborhood town. You had to work the police beat, you had to cover the courts, you had to cover City Hall and the county government, then maybe work your way up to the legislation. Now, all of this by way of building your credibility first with your peers and then with your audience, whether the audience was in print or radio. Now, because I was a bad speller, I didn't last in print very long, and I got boosted into radio. And in radio, the same thing, even with just no sight, all you have are people's ears. I learned at a very early age that if you wanted to talk about a hurricane, you could build your authenticity by going to the hurricane. You certainly could stay in the radio studio and take the Weather Bureau things, and you could build a reputation of someone with a very nice voice and somebody who read well, but you wouldn't build a reputation of a reporter. On the other hand, if you went to the hurricane and the closer to the eye of the hurricane, these were fundamental things that I learned the lesson early, that the audience understands if you are authentic. And if you want to stay in journalism, it was my, for a long time, I'm not playing humble beginnings here, I had a hard time making a living in journalism. So the question for me, how could I hang on by my fingernails? And I decided, be authentic, and people will recognize that, and that may keep you in the game.
Yeah, I think it's the old, I forget, it's been attributed to Lenny Bruce or George Burns or Carol Burnett. It's like, authenticity is the most important thing, so if you can fake that, you've got it made.
Yeah,
maybe.
exactly. I've never found a way to fake it.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've never found anybody who could fake it. Not in news.
Not for real.
No.
Yeah. No. Let me ask you this. And we'll get some questions from the audience if you have any. Little fun question. I read that, and I had known this, that Robert Redford is planning to play you in a movie about the Bush National Guard document controversy.
Well, here's the story on that. I never thought this movie would get made. For better or for worse, and we'll discuss the Bush story at another time if you like, but this is not the place. In the wake of the controversy over the Bush story, I will say it was a true story, and some very good people got fired, and eventually I lost my own job over a true story. You can talk about the process by which we arrived at the truth, but we arrived at the truth. At any rate, the producer of that segment, the lead producer, was a woman named Mary Mapes. Great producer, one of the great news producers of her generation. And she was fired forthwith. She wrote a book called Truth and Duty. Yeah. Truth, Duty, and Honor, I think. She wrote this book in 2006. The book did pretty well. I could recommend it. It's well written, a good read. The movie was, they took an option on it. Nothing happened for years. And earlier this year, I was told that they're going to make a movie about the book. It is the story of what happened behind the scenes with the Bush story, how the story was developed, how the network abandoned her, and for that matter, the rest of us, how the top echelon of the corporate entity caved to the Washington power we talked about earlier. And the movie's being made with Robert Redford plays the role of your narrator. I am not the subject of this film. Mary Mapes, the producer, is, but inevitably when you tell the story, so Redford's playing my part, and if they had to choose somebody, I'm glad they chose him.
Not bad.
Not bad at all, no.
And Mary's got to be happy that Kate Blanchett is going to be
and
her.
she plays the part of Mary Mapes. Exactly.
So that really is, at the end, to tie it all up before we get to questions, we all know that the exit was not done properly, not done well.
That would say the least.
Yes. Richard Thornburg, we can go into all of that.
Right.
But at the end of the day, this is the corporate thing you were talking about. When it came time to, you believe, I believe, let me not phrase it that way, Bill Paley, if he's in charge, he stands up for you and the news division, whereas the corporate overlords did not?
Yes. Short answer is yes. Because Mr. Paley had demonstrated, look, Bill Paley was not perfect, but on the really big things, he stood behind his reporters. He stood behind his reporters in the early stages of what Churchill called the gathering storm in Europe, when they were under a lot of criticism. He stood behind his reporters during the McCarthy era, which was extremely difficult for him. He stood behind his reporters during the Vietnam War, very controversial. Stood behind us during the Watergate period, that widespread criminal conspiracy, which we call by shorthand Watergate. Time and again, Mr. Paley, who owned CBS News, lock, stock, and barrel for the longest time, took the attitude, I'm in business to make money, but news is it's a public service. If news makes money, I'm pleased, but if it doesn't make money, I'm not bothered. And there needs to be a wall between the corporate money-making portion of our corporation and our public service news division. And because of that, Paley could often say to, for example, an embattled President Richard Nixon, or a furious President Lyndon Johnson who complained about the Vietnam War coverage, to pick just two examples. Mr. President, I understand what you're saying, and I may even agree with it, but I hire my news people to be independent. And trust me, Mr. President, they are independent. And I see our news operation is operating in public service, and I'm not going to do what you want me to do. In President Nixon's case, fire this young whippersnapper rather off the being a White House correspondent or during the Vietnam War, fire Morley Safer. The answer to your question is no. It wouldn't have happened during the Paley period, and it happens now, but I think for one reason, I'm not here to defend the top captains of industry, but I think their entities are so large, the people who sit at the very top. No argument about public service or news being a public trust can penetrate through them. Is it good for our stockholder value? Is it good for our corporate profit line? And if it isn't, then it has to go. And that's basically what happened to us at CBS.
It's interesting, you know, obviously reading over the course of your career, famous moments bubble up, whether it's what you did in Dallas in the wake of the assassination or what you did in the civil rights movement, of course, I don't know, getting beat up at the 68 convention,
right.
or
right.
your famous exchange with President Nixon when he asked if you were running for anything, and then of course the Mujahideen. When these things are happening, do you go, oh yeah, this is something that's going to...
No, widely believed it may not be, but true it is. When you're in the vortex of a story, such as the Kennedy assassination, let's just take that example. Listen, it was the same emotional earthquake to myself and to other reporters when it happened. But in those instances when you realize not only is the president been shot, but the president is dead, you know, emotionally, psychologically, you have a choice. Then you're going to weep and you're going to go into grief as everybody else, or you're going to say to yourself, can't do that. I got to drive that deep down. I have to be focused. I have to be what the tennis players call zoned. Nothing matters but the story. This is the essence of being a reporter. Nothing matters but the story. There's the dark side of this. Birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas, religious holidays go by them. But so it clicks in if you're a pro. And what everybody else is experiencing at the time, you drive down deep within yourself or kick it outside. Now, 10 days after the Kennedy assassination, I had my emotional, I won't say breakdown, but my emotional response to it. In the same way on a big running story like the Vietnam War or Watergate, it's a long running story, but again, when you're in the middle of it, you're so focused on the story and what you have to do that things like fear, for example, listen, every person who's in the midst of combat, whether they're a combatant or a correspondent, is afraid. And I've been afraid plenty of times, but it's not so much a matter of courage as it is just, I'm a pro. I'm here. This is the job I got to do. Nothing else matters. I can't be thinking about my wife and kids and what happens to them if I draw a shell. You've got to do it. Same thing with Watergate. There was a time during Watergate, you know, it was a slow building story, different from a quick thing like an assassination, different from a war zone. Slow, the story's accumulating. You don't want to believe the story. You say, I don't want to believe this about my president. But then the evidence begins to overwhelm you, and at some point, it's controversial. You're sitting at the kitchen table, the kids are in bed, they've done their homework, and your wife says, Dan, you know I love you and I support you the rest of your life, but we're pretty far out there on a limb on this story. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Or some version of that. Or what happens to us if it doesn't pan out? And then quickly you say, look, you know what I do, this is what we do, I think we're right on the story. But that's the reality of it. But if you ever let that consume you, this is the point, then you lose your focus on the story. So the answer is, if you love covering news, if you have any modicum of experience, something clicks in and it's all focused, only the story matters, nothing else matters.
Let's take a couple of quick questions. Anybody have a question for Mr. Rather? Here we go, microphone person.
I actually have two. One is, of all the current news anchors out there, be it on cable or broadcast, who are some of the ones you respect? And also, as far as the state of currently cable news, be it Fox, CNBC, CNN, what's your take on that and kind of the way it's going?
Roy, help me here. I don't always hear as well as I want. I want to make sure I understand the question.
He had two questions. Of the current anchors, do you have a favorite? Do you have anybody that you think is really kind of walking in the footsteps? And two, when it comes to the cable landscape, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, any take on that?
Well, as to the first, that I know, I think I can say I know all of the current anchors except Mr. Bureau, who's just taken the anchor chair at ABC. I don't know him. I will say that of the other anchors, not only do I know them, that I respect them. And they have the goods. They want to walk in the steps. They want to keep the flame burning. But it's extremely difficult for them to do so under the circumstances that I marked before. Don't walk out of here saying that I'm critical of Brian Williams or anybody else. Scott Pelley, who's not only somebody that I helped to hire, if you will, helped to bring along, great respect for him. They have to operate within the system. And in doing so, there are compromises that have to be made. And as a result of that, you know, are they likely to go down as another Ed Murrow? Nobody's going to go down as an Ed Murrow, but walk the steps. Let me put it this way. I think they do the best they can under the circumstances, and I admire them for it. They have a much more difficult time than I had in my period. So that deals with that. And they're qualified. Diane Sawyer made of herself a first-rate journalist. She didn't come to journalism right away. She came to it late. Made of herself a first-rate journalist. I think she did a terrific job there. Now, as to the state of cable news, and I'm pausing only because, again, I want to give them their due, that they have CNN and MSNBC have the most resources of anybody doing cable. MSNBC because they have NBC, and CNN has fantastic resources. Fox does not have the resources. I'm talking now about experienced foreign correspondents, worldwide reach, but I lament the idea that we get balkanized. That is, that Fox sees itself as to the right of center politically. They may want to argue with that, and sometimes they've argued with me, but I think by any reasonable person would say that they have cast themselves in the mold of right of center. MSNBC, to state the obvious, have cast themselves as a counterbalance to that at left of center. I prefer the model that says, listen, we break out windows on both sides of the street. We're not Republican, we're not Democrat, we're not right, we're not left, we're not conservative, we're not liberal. We're trying to do a decent job of reporting the news. But increasingly, the game becomes finding your niche audience, finding an audience that in a way wants to hear what they think already. No, I'm not sure this is making sense to you.
Yeah.
And I lament this. Now, if it were a CNN person in a room, the CNN person might say, well, listen, Dan Rather, we at CNN have tried to stake out a middle course, if you will, and it has not been successful. And I don't have the answer to that, but I would, in answer to your question, I prefer the CNN model over the other models. I worry that CNN today may be losing some of their brand because in an effort to find an audience when big news is not breaking, they're going increasingly to programming. But they don't need to tell me how to program their channel.
Another question.
Really quick question?
Yeah, one question, yes.
Quick question, not to put a slide on cable news, but you think that it's necessary that when big news comes out that they need to run the same story continuously 24/7 and kind of roadblock everything else?
No, you may want to repeat the question so the audience can hear that question. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's what he was saying. He
Yeah.
was saying that, he's wondering, the repetitiveness. The plane goes missing, the Malaysian Air goes missing,
No.
and we get 24/7.
No. Well, over-coverage, under-coverage is a great problem. I mentioned before, under-coverage of deep digging investigative exposés is underdone. Top-flight international coverage is vastly underdone. But breaking news is sometimes overdone, and we've had any number of examples of that. The missing plane is one. And here's what happens. This is This is part of what's infected the business. It is to say, okay, we're looking at the ratings and we're looking at the demographics. We run this airplane story, and you know what? When we run the airplane story, our ratings and demographics go up. So we're not going to run this story once every 15 minutes. We're not going to run it once every half hour. We're going to run it all day, all night, every day, and every night until the end. Now, obviously, from a quality news standpoint, what's wrong with this is what's happening in the rest of the world does not get covered. And, you know, the plea, can we please have some context, perspective, and depth in our reporting, goes by the boards. But again, while saying I'm an optimist for at least the short run, I think this will continue when there's big breaking news in a desperate effort to grab what they see as the ratings and demographic high ground. They'll run it to you driving crazy. You know, there is a point with cable news when if you listen to it for more than 15 or 20 minutes, it will drive you batty. Because it's just repetitious over and over and over again.
Before we wrap it up, I want to say one quick thing that I came across that I'd never heard before. The night of your last broadcast, you wore a T-shirt underneath your suit and tie.
That's true.
And on this T-shirt were 3 letters, F-E-A.
Same T-shirt I wore the first night I did the broadcast.
And what did that stand for?
Well, you know, I'm old school. We have ladies and young people in the audience.
I'm new school. I'm new school, so I will tell you that Mr. Rather's T-shirt on his last night, as well as his first night, was basically "fuck 'em all," and I think that's quite a good banner to march forward under. So please join me in thanking Mr. Dan Rather for.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.